Hello, welcome back to Avolution's Enterprise Architecture Summit. This session, which is to be given by Andrew Luthwaite, which I think many of you will know just from the various other webinars we've hosted and, of course, other digital summits. Andrew Luthwaite is the pre-sales lead at Avolution. He's had other roles in the past. Andrew's been with us 10 years. And as I say, he's frequently giving our webinars and presentations. Okay, so then, as I say, it's my pleasure now to be able to hand over to Andrew for our presentation on how to master capability and process modeling. Andrew.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter. So yeah, I have a few slides I'll go through first, but really for the bulk of today's, I guess you can call it a presentation, is to actually take you through Abacus itself and show you some of the content in there around how to master capability and process modeling. Alongside a few other things as well, which you'll come across. So, yeah, first of all, I guess thank you for everyone for joining. There's been some great sessions on today, and we'll probably reference a couple of those actually as we go through. And like Peter said, we should have time at the end for questions as well. As a bit of context, very quickly, today's section is actually the second part, if you like, of a three-part series that we've started. So the first session was a couple of weeks before the Digital Summit. And that was generally around how to start the architectural journey. And really that emphasis, and certainly the whole series emphasis, is on mastering EA modeling. So that's around using Abacus, using the modeler, user, and persona, and actually being able to draw and diagram content within the tool. So today, like you can see, we've got the capability and process modeling session. And then after the summit, we'll also look at how we can build specific dashboards to help tailor and persuade specific stakeholders based on the content that we're producing. Now, I'm not even sure if you've seen an overview of Avolution yet, but I suspect it was part of a previous presentation. But generally speaking, Avolution is the company, Abacus is the tool, which hopefully most of you know on today's call. And we've been doing this for over 20 years. So as Peter mentioned, I've been here for 10 of those, just over 10 of those. And there's a few stats you'll see on the screen here, but the two I want to pick up on quickly, and it's something you would have heard potentially this morning from Tim's session, is the diagram-driven and data-driven concepts within Abacus. So we, of course, want to be able to provide a platform that is data-driven, i.e. automated data import, automated diagram generation and visualizations. But for many architects, having a diagram-driven solution alongside a data-driven solution is also important. And what I mean specifically by diagram-driven is the ability to actually manually draw something, drag and drop, and build a specific diagram or model using Abacus. For context as well, there are two parts to Abacus. So there's Abacus Enterprise and Abacus Studio. Some of you, of course, have used Abacus. So lots of customers are on the call today. Some of you are potentially new to Abacus. And the focus today is going to be on Abacus Enterprise, leveraging the modeler license. So that ability to actually build and draw things within the tool. Studio is much more around the configuration and administrative aspects of the tool, as well as building some of the algorithms and actually customizing some of the model as well. So if you want to get access to the tool, please feel free to reach out. But the focus today will be purely on Abacus Enterprise. Now, in the description for today's webinar, there's probably a broad range of topics that we've maybe mentioned. So I've kind of categorized this as business architecture models for now. And really the idea is the content that we go through, of course, will likely span across multiple different domains within a particular model or within a particular framework that you're using. So from a data application and technology perspective, there's of course a few things that you might be wanting to capture: applications, databases, and infrastructure. But the business focus today is really on some of the high level, I guess you can call them artifacts, that we typically see customers building. And of course, templated things that we would also have out of the box for you as well. So that could be strategy one-pager views, process diagrams, value streams. These are typically the models that we see customers building. And these are some of the models that I want to take you through in a live Abacus environment. So let's jump into Abacus. And the first thing you'll see here, and I'll just turn off my camera for this one because it looks like I'm ignoring you by looking at another screen. But Abacus Enterprise is, as you can see, browser-based. And really what we're doing here is leveraging the ability to build specific dashboards. And each of these dashboards contain a collection of visualizations. Specifically for this dashboard I'm showing right here, these are some of the example diagrams that I quickly mentioned on the slide there. Now, a lot of these diagrams, maybe specifically this business capability map, are likely either being built in Abacus or being imported in from external sources as well. So capability maps could be ranging from APQC models, buy on service landscape models. There's various capability models that you could be leveraging. The main idea here, though, is as users within Abacus Enterprise, we'll have the option to come in and edit these views and actually start customizing and tailoring these views according to either the stakeholder we're building these for. So that could be adding new processes or capabilities, or maybe even just changing some of the notation. So changing some of the color styles or heat mapping styles that we've applied onto this view. So for example, some of these processes and some of the high level capabilities are being heat mapped according to specific recommendation scores. That could be a tolerate, invest, migrate, eliminate status. It could be whether we actually want to further develop some of these processes and capabilities. We could be coloring these according to costs and other types of properties that we're capturing. But the idea is that we have a way to manually adjust these views if we wanted to, even if these were then automatically built based on the data sets. A couple of others just to quickly jump into. So for example, a more dedicated process view. This is incorporating aspects from BPMN, and we'll take a deeper dive into this in a few minutes. But this isn't just a pure business process, let's say diagram just around the business domain. You can see, for example, applications, goals or strategies, and various data objects that we're linking these business processes to as well. So as much as we might categorize things as process diagrams, very often, and it's something you would have seen earlier on during Nick's presentation with Helsana and HMRC, is that there are other aspects that these processes are connected to outside of the business architecture domain, let's say. There's also I would probably argue to say the kind of higher level business architecture concepts that you'd like to model in here as well. So this is going to be ranging from high-level objectives, goals, or requirements that you want to model, through to high-level strategic content and the vision of the company or the business and IT vision that you want to model. These are also going to be supported throughout the tool through different notations. So notations in Abacus are really just dictating the types of objects and relationships we can utilize. And so if we think of notations like arguments, for example, in this case, we would be using something like a BMM, a business motivational model. We might be using business modeling canvas or a C4 notation. These are all notations that are going to be available out of the box. And we're using the modeler license in here to actually start building things from those notations. There's a few benefits to this. First is maybe standardizing on the views that you want to build. Quite often, if you're coming from, let's say, a drawing tools like Visio, for example, the lack of standards in there and the lack of adherence to those standards means that people are drawing things multiple different ways, even if they mean to be representing the same thing. And of course, the benefit in here is that we can be very specific about what our objectives look like or what our goals and requirements look like, and apply that standard to any user who wants to build any of these diagrams in Abacus. And that's really one of the fundamental things from an Abacus perspective, is allowing these diagrams to be built from a standard that is fully adjustable by you as users as well. So as much as we support all those notations, you might obviously be combining some of those together. The main idea here is that you can actually be leveraging those across the entire organization. It's worth quickly pointing out as well, within Abacus Enterprise, I can essentially edit this view because I'm a modeler user, but keep in mind that anyone who wants to see this view also has access. So it's a company-wide access. So any of the visualizations you build, any of the dashboards you build, which you'll see a bit more of later on, anyone has read-only access to this. So embedding these in Confluence sites or team sites is usually the best way to, I guess, lower the barrier to entry for some users so they can access this architectural repository without thinking of it as an EA tool necessarily, but actually accessing these views, providing feedback on these views, and allowing the modelers to go ahead and actually make those adjustments later on. So again, enterprise is trying to incorporate all of those different types of users on one platform. So now specifically, let's just jump to a blank view in here. And what I want to do is show you what it looks like to actually start creating some content. So I'll go ahead and create a new diagram within my as-is architecture. And then I'm going to be choosing this process diagram viewpoint or stencil. Like I mentioned earlier on, these are just notations that we can use. And then these notations allow us to use selected objects and relationships from the model. So let's just call this a business process to keep it easy. So when we create the content, in this case, this entire new diagram, it's going to start off as a blank visualization. And then we have the option to edit this view. And then this time, because we've built this off the swim lane notation, the process swim lane notation, we're going to be given access to some of the process components and some of the process connections. I'll quickly make a comment here, and it probably just maybe references one of Mark's comments on the last presentation. As much as we support kind of entire frameworks and notations, in this case, something like BPMN, it's not necessarily the case that you'd want to use that entire model. So for example, we have support for TOGAF, but you're using the parts that are necessary for the task at hand. In a very similar way for something like BPMN. BPMN is quite a descriptive language. There are, of course, other notations, EPC, for example. But BPMN being, right, dare I say, very descriptive, you don't necessarily need to use all of it. So all of the different kind of 15 intermediate events and timer events that you might want to build. If there's a need and a want to build those, of course, go ahead and do so. But for some organizations, starting off from a subset of those is a better way to try to implement some of these views. So let's go ahead and start building some of these just to show you what this model user actually has the capability of doing. So we'll drag in, we'll start actually with the actor component. And let's just add in maybe a consultant. And this department, sorry, this actor is essentially a swim lane in Abacus. It's something that Nick referenced earlier on in his session, where the swim lanes don't have to be true BPMN swim lanes. You know, they could be applications, lines of business, people, roles. It could be anything you want in Abacus. In this case, we've decided to model, I guess, a person or a role in this case. And we'll start building out a process. So let's say for this one, we'll again, maybe just make reference to Tim's earlier presentation. So let's say the initial start event for this process is some kind of AI research this consultant is doing. Through his AI research, maybe this is potentially the way this kind of flow is happening within the organization. There's a process here where he finds he wants to use an AI tool. So we'll add this in as part of that process of what he's actually doing. For many organizations, this is typically classified as a task or an activity. And if you wanted to, you could specialize this later on as well. This is an AI tool that he's found he wants to use as part of that process. Now, what that might do is then trigger potentially another area within the organization. So let's say the cybersecurity team. And through that, it's then triggering some kind of decision that that cybersecurity team needs to take on board. So in this case, it could be, should we allow the installation of that AI tool potentially? So let's go for allow installation. When we make these types of decisions in Abacus, and specifically, I guess, around BPMN, there's usually a couple of outcomes to these. So for example, one of those outcomes could be, yes, we'll allow the installation. So the AI tool is installed. And again, we'll just correct some of this in here. And then the alternative, of course, is that it's not installed. And so we'll just add this into the existing process for cybersecurity, potentially denying something like that. So let's say not installed. And realistically, these are probably going to be end events that you're modeling within here as well. Now, each of these connections and components in Abacus are treated in a very similar way, in the sense that they all have their own properties and they can all be then fully customized further down the line. In this case, for these sequence flow connections, we might just want to edit these connections and say that this is potentially the kind of yes solution if we're going to allow the installation. And then a description on this connection could then potentially be the no. So we're not going to allow the installation of this particular application. So those are the few things that we might change on the connections. And then, of course, likewise on the components, we also want to maybe edit some of these properties and connections. One of the benefits of hopefully using Abacus in this context is, as a process owner or a process modeling user in this perspective, I don't necessarily want to have access by default to all of the content in the repository. So you can see there are some optional properties that I can be accessing on this process, potentially some very specific BPMN properties, or maybe some specific Abacus properties around the cost, or whether this is a manual or automated task or activity as part of that process. These things can then be accessed by those users. So again, in Abacus, there's a whole permissions model. We have different users who are logging in. They have access to certain things. And in this case, they may only have access to a limited amount of properties, components, and connections. And then from here, this then may just lead on to a typical end event, let's say. And then I guess it's just maybe use the tool. So in its most basic form as a modeler user, that's simply how we might start constructing some of these visualizations, some of these diagrams, using something like the BPMN notation. From here, it's then relatively easy just to extend this outside of that business architecture domain. So for example, this particular AI tool might link to an actual application. So let's call this ChatGPT. And so now we have a specific application, and dare I say likely a service, that this process is then connected to. And again, we could be connecting this ChatGPT application further down the line to an existing database. And we may suddenly find that it's accessing our CRM to surface some of these results. So potentially a harmless decision to try and install some kind of AI tool that a consultant wants to use and has likely been allowed to install is then accessing potentially sensitive information in our CRM database. And this is partly why these business processes, specifically in Abacus, aren't necessarily modeled in isolation. So quite often we are detailing the process like this. We might have the high-level capability maps I showed earlier on, but the benefits come from connecting these processes to other parts of the organization. And the main reason for this is twofold, really. First, to explore the information so users can drill down through that model. But secondly, there are many different situations that come up where you want to understand the connections across these different domains. So new regulations come into play. So GDPR and DORA, for example, that's influencing how we capture information. We need to know if there are any critical systems accessing that content and if they're supporting any critical processes internally. So new regulations are a great way of understanding how databases, applications, and processes are related to each other, and then how we can actually analyze that portfolio to see how those changes are going to be affecting and potentially how we need to be abiding by new controls and mechanisms in place to those new standards that are coming into play. Now, keep in mind, again, as I've mentioned, all of this is, again, fully customizable. So if you wanted to redesign the notation, if we wanted to heat map these applications according to different properties, all of that can be done directly in Abacus. And we can change all of those on the fly onto any of these visualizations that we have here. Now, from this level of process mapping, if I quickly come back to the view here, all of these views that we have around the dashboarding environments are going to be customized based on the stakeholder that's accessing them. So if you take a look at the drop down here, if I was to go to a specific business dashboard, I now have access to many different components, connections, visualizations, and diagrams, not just focused on capabilities and processes, but also looking at different properties around costs, lifecycle dates, and in this case, things like customer journey maps and graph views that I can drill down into. So those process diagrams themselves are going to be useful from a design perspective, becomes more useful when we actually start combining this with other visualizations on a single dashboard. Now, a couple more things I just want to touch on. I will just move this slightly because my Zoom header is stopping me accessing this dashboard. But what I want to emphasize, if we come back to this business capability map, is when we start looking at these specific data sets. So let's say we were looking at managed customer service as a capability. And let's maybe just drill down into what that solution actually looks like in Abacus. So this is a diagram that's drawn in Abacus. In reality, actually, this is an automated diagram. It's built off all the relationships in the model. So as much as it has been automatically built, I can still make manual adjustments if I needed to. But what we'll find in here is a view showing the capability domain through to applications, technologies, and infrastructure. And one of the things I want to emphasize if we zoom in is if I happen to select one of these capabilities or processes at this top level, so I'll just select this plan and manage customer service contacts. Abacus is going to start filtering all of these other visualizations to represent that level I'm at. So that's going to be hopefully one of the main benefits you'll get from using these dynamic dashboards. Secondly, though, if I take a look at the catalog view, I can see some related processes already have specific departments, and some potentially have applications that are being used by this process or processes that are being performed by specific departments. Quite often, we might not necessarily know what information should be in this box, and it potentially is someone else's responsibility to fill in. One of the quick things we can do, though, and something you would have seen this morning, is we can just ask Abacus. So if we just ask Abacus what it thinks these values should be, you'll see it's that quick in suggesting that the AU customer service department is likely the department that's performing this process. So this is augmenting information in Abacus based off the machine learning concepts that are running behind the scenes. And it's also suggesting a particular application, in this case Abacus, that should be used for planning our workforce and service workforce. Now, again, it's potentially 36% confident that it is this customer service department. It's slightly more confident that Abacus is the application to be used. But one of the things it's not going to do is fill this in for me. I can accept these changes if I want to, or of course, I might want to plug in more information, let Abacus retrain on that model, and then it might provide a slightly higher confidence in some of these data sets that we have in here as well. So that's really where some of the machine learning concepts and some of the AI capabilities in Abacus can start influencing, even from a business architecture perspective, around processes and capabilities, how we'd actually surface some of the information and starting to fill in some of these blank cells from that catalog perspective. Now, that's been a bit of a focus around the business architecture concepts, but these sessions are meant to be a bit shorter. But one thing I will quickly do is show one final dashboard, just as an idea of what's potentially coming in part 3 of this Mastering EA Modeling session. A lot of the content so far, of course, has been how do we actually produce these diagrams? How do we actually use these core features for building visualizations? But in the part 3, we're going to be driving this more from a dashboarding perspective. And there's a few reasons for this. So when we start connecting processes to applications, we want to understand those dependencies and the impact changes in other parts of the architecture are going to have on our processes and capabilities. One of the things that we might do is use sliders to try and drag these end of life dates across just to see how this landscape is going to be changing over time. So we can see in here the end of life date for some of our applications. And here we've got a very specific view of all the applications currently in Germany. If I start dragging this slider across to change the end of life dates, what you'll notice is that these visualizations are going to start being updated with some of the new applications that potentially are coming into play. But you'll also notice down here some of these applications that are being removed from the model because we're shifting that end of life date. So we're changing that minimum end of life date. So hopefully we can get a clearer picture of what's actually in production today. You'll also notice that happening on the actual application landscape diagram. Just because it's a diagram doesn't mean it's static. It's also updating and filtering out anything that has potentially now reached end of life. So it's a great way of seeing historical changes in Abacus to see where things, well, see what things used to look like. And it's also a great way of seeing what's happening in the future as to which new applications are going to be coming into play. So like I said, we'll cover a bit more of that in part 3, and that's certainly going to be covering more detailed dashboards and on how we can combine some of these views together.